Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I think we'll get started. I know some folks will potter in during the course of the talk. And welcome to all the attendees on Zoom as well. So I hope you can hear us, and we'll be excited to take your questions towards the end. So Jan is someone I met about a month ago. There was a meeting called NextMed Health that's run by Daniel Kraft, and it's really a meeting where they sort of bring those who are shaping the future of healthcare. There were about 50 speakers, and his was the most memorable presentation. It was a 50-minute presentation, and it sort of changed my perspective on what's possible in healthcare. And so I asked him to come, and he and his team, JC and Jesse, have kindly agreed to do so. He has this wonderful spirit where he's not only interested in educating folks, but in sort of changing sort of healthcare on a global level, but also fostering deep and meaningful collaborations that cross, agnostic to any particular discipline. And so he's coming here really to meet you all and to look for opportunities to take his team's technology and translate that into patients' care. And that's why I came to Mayo, and that's what we do so well here. So he'll speak a little bit about his institution, the work he's doing, and then Dr. Carter will have a quick fireside chat with him towards the end, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity to really ask some questions and hopefully stimulate future conversations. So the first of many, but thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you. Okay, it works now. Great. Thanks for being here. I just do one slide about Click Labs, where we come from. So Click Labs is a private research lab that is attached to Click Health, which is a commercialization agency. We're fairly new. We only started doing research maybe 8 years ago. But we're working in a field of digital biomarkers, which initially was device-based biomarkers, and we have now moved to vocal biomarkers, which is sort of the ideal space for us. We've published a few papers. I thought 40 was pretty cool, but then I spoke to a few of you and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to brag about this. But we have a few patents, we have a few papers, it's just the beginning. The way we work, though, is we're a private lab, but our goal is to commercialize and develop technique in partnership with hospitals. We are not a hospital, so we work in collaboration with hospitals, usually under a model of equal collaboration. We do our part, the hospital does their part, and we co-own the IP and the publications after that. So we work with hospitals all over the world. We're based in Canada. A lot of our work is Canadian, but we're doing some really cool work in Singapore right now, some work in the UK. We have no border. We're country agnostic. I'm going to start talking first about diabetes because the project I first presented at that conference was about diabetes, but I will also show you a number of other disease areas for which we are developing vocal biomarkers. Is the voice okay, or there's a weird sound? No? Okay. So diabetes, I probably don't need to tell anybody here, but is a really big problem. There's hundreds of millions of people with diabetes. That number is growing all the time. And what's very interesting and even more problematic is about 50% of people with diabetes don't know they have diabetes, which is hugely problematic and surprising because it's not difficult to diagnose diabetes. It's in fact very easy. So we don't have a problem of technology or medical technology, or we don't have a medical problem. We have an access to screening problem. People don't know they should go get A1C test. And I don't know if you see, I'm in a way here. Most of the population who is undiagnosed is in developing countries with even more difficulty of access. So as a researcher in digital biomarker, this is an opportunity. Every problem is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for digital biomarkers. Since the actual blood test and real regular technology exists and works really well, we need to do something upstream, and we could do this with digital biomarkers. And digital biomarkers traditionally are a combination of data that we get from sensors, could be wearable sensors, cameras, any sort of technology that collects digital data, treats it algorithmically until we have some sort of measurement that is a surrogate for a real biomarker. In a case of diabetes, dealing with those 240 million people who are undiagnosed, we have a few more constraints. Some are classic. We need to be non-invasive, because if we're going invasive, we might as well do a blood test or a Lancet. We also need to be scalable, and extremely scalable, software-level scalability, where the cost of developing the first one is pretty much the cost, and all the subsequent versions of the test are cheap or free. So we cannot build anything that is tangible, which means no new hardware. If we have to build a sensor, a patch, a sticker, anything that is tangible, and we need to make 240 million copies of it and then find who needs it, it's not going to work. But we still need to collect some data. It's a digital biomarker. Since we cannot produce new hardware, we have to use hardware that exists. Conveniently, every single person in the world, more or less, has a phone. There's literally nowhere in the world where you would find people without phones. So that's really convenient. And phones do a lot of things. One of the things they do really well that almost nobody uses them for anymore is recording voice. We don't speak with our phones anymore, but even the cheapest phone is really good at collecting voice, at removing the noise. I've opened a bunch of phones. They have multiple microphones inside. Like, they are amazing device for recording voice. So that's what we want to leverage. And this is where we work with vocal biomarkers. So vocal biomarkers are based on the principle of using voice to know something medically relevant about a patient. That's not new. We can do this as humans. You do this as trained humans. You can use lexical semantic signals, how somebody speaks, to diagnose or at least get an indication of Alzheimer, for example. Or we can use the flatness or the emotional dynamic nature of the voice to identify maybe Parkinson's or depression. Or we can listen to the breathiness for all kinds of respiratory disease. These have been done for a long time. It wasn't even called vocal biomarker, it was just medicine. And humans can do it, machine can also do it. The new one, and this is very new, that field did not exist 5 years ago, is acoustic biomarker. That's where we start to listen to acoustic properties of the voice that are way below the speech. It's like being a piano tuner and listening to the piano and knowing that there's too much humidity in a room. It's looking very, very low level. And that gives us insight into metabolic features like diabetes, for example. So our first project, the one that sort of launched us into this whole field, is, we called it Voice to Diabetes, because catchy name. And I have a quick video I'm going to show you.
Our voice can change the world. And for developing countries like India, considered the diabetes capital of the world, it now has the power to save lives. Introducing Voice to Diabetes, turning voice samples into an equitable life-saving tool for millions.
A major step forward in diabetes detection.
This team of scientists built an algorithm that can detect type 2 diabetes
just by having them speak into their smartphone.
Which is insane. This is very cool stuff.
Yeah, it is, and without even pricking your finger or getting a blood test. This is crazy.
This groundbreaking innovation has already generated nearly 4 billion impressions. But what matters most is the significant impact it has on people's lives.
India is the diabetes capital of the world. Unfortunately, 50% of them are still undiagnosed. Voice to Diabetes will be able to give access to the 1 billion people who have mobile phones and could save countless lives.
Our study, published October 2023 in a peer-reviewed journal, analyzed over 18,000 voice recordings. We found unique features such as pitch, jitter, and shimmer, enabling type 2 diabetes screening accuracy of 89% for women and 86% for men. Our study distinguished the differences in female and male voices, ensuring equity throughout the entire process.
Voice to Diabetes has already helped thousands of people, offering higher accuracy and personalized results compared to existing solutions, while reducing costs by $32 billion globally. And with developing hospital partnerships, ongoing approval in several countries and 7 studies in other disease states currently underway, it will continue to save lives, including my own.
As you can see, this was published in a very good journal. Yeah. So explaining a bit what we found in the voice. The voice, once we remove the speech, we look at the acoustic property, there's a lot of features. There are over 10,000, maybe 20,000 features we can extract. And these tend to be very abstract mathematical function of the voice. But for diabetes, it turns out that the features were very simple. It's all centered around pitch, the fundamental frequency of your voice that can be represented as a sine wave. And the pitch has features that change in diabetes. So for women, we have jitter. And what's very interesting is what changes in the voice is different for women and men, completely different. So women with diabetes have more jitter. And the jitter is modulation of the fundamental frequency. So the fundamental frequency changes a bit over time, rapidly. Whereas for men, it's the amplitude that changes. Fundamental frequency is more stable, but the amplitude modulation changes. It's a bit like FM and AM. In fact, it is exactly FM and AM, but it's called shimmer and jitter. This gets built into a model, a predictive model that can be fed a new voice that it has never heard before, and it would return a score, which is the likelihood that this person has diabetes. One of the features of digital biomarker that's quite interesting is you can manipulate the sensitivity and specificity, so hard to say those words, the sensitivity and specificity of the model to suit the application. So as you can see, we have threshold. There's a lot of numbers here, but ultimately what matters is that depending on where the model is implemented, if it's used at triage in a hospital and the next action would be get a blood test, or if it's used in a remote community and the next action might be you now need to drive to the hospital to get a blood test, we may have to deal with different level of specificity because we can't have the same tolerance for false positive or false negative. And it's highly tunable, which is the beauty of those models. The accuracy, as you saw in the video, is in the 80% level. It's pretty good for a voice biomarker. It's good because we're comparing it to screening tools. For example, CanRisk, which is what we use in Canada, is a survey-based tool that asks you, age, BMI, how much vegetables you eat, and it gives you a score. And that's not very accurate. So our tool is better than that. It is not meant to replace A1C or GTT. Absolutely not, because that works really well. What we want to do is widen that funnel of healthcare and bring people to get a blood test, get treated, monitored, and live longer, healthier life. Because the gap, as I was mentioning earlier, is up here in the screening. This is why those hundreds of millions of people don't know they have diabetes. The study we did was in India initially, and we had a lot of questions such as, does it work on different accents? Does it work on different ethnicities? Does it work on smokers and so on? So less than a year after we published our result, there's a team in Luxembourg who I was meeting with yesterday. We're collaborating on research, did the same study in the US on different ethnicities and different accents and got virtually the same result. And they also confirmed that smoking is not impacting the result, which was one of our big questions. So this is really good. We now know that this works regardless of ethnicities and regardless of smoking status. Why is the voice affected by diabetes? That's a little less of a mystery. The sort of physiological relationship is due to the fact that diabetes is a disease. It damages our body, but it damages specifically the muscle, the nerves, and even the vocal cord. So there's long established research as how the voice is affected by diabetes. What we've done is created a model out of this. On the regulatory side, our goal ultimately is to make sure this is distributed, this is used worldwide. We don't want to sell it in very small number to a pharma company to do a study. We want this to be used all over India and Africa and Asia. So we had to find a regulatory pathway that facilitates that. In this case, We first did it in Canada because that's where we're from. It's a class 1 software as a medical device that is equivalent from a regulatory standpoint to those questionnaire-based screening tools. So we don't want this to be too high on a regulatory chain because that limits the ability of adoption. Now, this was our first success, but looking back at the fact that everybody has a cell phone and voice is a bit like a blood sample, you can do all kinds of tests on it. We started looking at other opportunities. What else can we do with voice? And at very high level, the opportunities are on diagnosing and screening, like what we're doing with diabetes, but there's also treatment response. Can we identify something that changes in the voice after a treatment? Or disease monitoring with or without treatment? Or, of course, remote and telehealth, because we're using phones. These can be combined. So after diabetes, we did a bunch of other projects, and I'm going to show you some projects that are just completed, and then I will show you a few that are still going on right now. The first one is hypertension. Hypertension is very similar to diabetes in a sense that there's a lot of undiagnosed individual. It's asymptomatic. The way to diagnose hypertension is really simple. So the problem is not technology, it's screening. So we looked at the voice to see, can we find anything? And using the learning of our first study on diabetes, we changed a few things in the study protocol. We used a fixed sentence, just like we had for diabetes, where everybody had to say the same phrase. We also used a random sentence because we're like, what if we could detect it from covert speech, just listening to people talking? So we have the result. With fixed sentence, we have a pretty good accuracy, 84, 85%. And with random sentence, this is not published yet. It's in peer review round 3 with digital biomarker. It should be out soon, hopefully. It dropped a little bit, but it doesn't drop a lot. This is still useful as a screening tool, and it's much more convenient to use random sentences. We've had a few learnings for this project. So we learned that fixed versus sentences, we can use both, we can use either. We've also expanded our feature set. We found a whole bunch of features in a voice associated with hypertension that are distinct from type 2 diabetes. So we could screen both independently because they don't overlap feature-wise. We also discovered that the voice has signal only in the first few seconds after you start talking. So when we break the sentence that people say in 4 chunks and we remove the first chunk, the model becomes better. So when I start talking, the first words that come out of my mouth are not very full of signal, but the rest is almost like the voice calibrates itself. So that's a good learning for future studies. We then moved on to glucose. Since we could identify diabetes, we're like, maybe we can measure glucose because that would be very convenient. And we ran a study with 500 people wearing a CGM and recording their voice 6 times a day to see if we could identify a feature in the voice associated with the variation in glucose. And we did. The outcome is we found a very clear and linear relationship between the fundamental frequency of the voice and the glucose level. This is an individual model, and it has a mathematical rationale based on Hooke's law. But what's amazing, it's an individual model, which means if we record someone's blood glucose level and their voice, we can then follow up through the day. As the glucose fluctuates, the fundamental frequency would fluctuate. If their glucose goes up, fundamental frequency would go up. This was a pilot study, so we now need to extend it to have a model that would be usable by the public. This was really sort of our first stage of research, but it's very exciting because we could, imagining a fairly near future state, we could screen people for diabetes and then provide them with an app that can let them check their glycemia during the day with just one calibration test once in a while. We also looked at fertility and ovulation. So this was a pilot study again, because we typically do our first study just to see if there is something in a voice, and then we move to the next stage where we build a model. And in this case, we had 16 women. We didn't need a control group because it was just naturally ovulating women. We measured hormone, body temperature, and voice once a day to see if there's a relationship. And we found something super interesting. This is the sort of result that gets us excited and builds the next study. We found that the pitch minimum was about 8.8% higher. And you can see here compared to the follicular phase, the signal here in this graph is that what's happening is this is lower, and then you have this long slope. This happens just before ovulation. It's not enough for us to make a predictive model. This is the kind of study where we want to find that there is something in the voice. There is something. We now will extend this research on a much larger group of women to create a model that can predict ovulation, hopefully 1 or maybe 2 days ahead. That's been published in JMIR. As we're doing a lot of voice research, we started to automate and create templates for our projects because there's a similarity on the technical side to how we study voice. So we created a framework both on the research side and on the technology side so that we can spin up those studies very quickly. From a research point of view, we have 3 typical studies. The first one is a pilot, I was mentioning, where we just look to see if there is something in the voice associated with some ground truth. So we need a group of people, we need some ground truth, and then we listen to their voice and see if anything changes. If it does, we do a study where we build a model. In this case, we get enough of the changes in the voice so that we can characterize that in a model, essentially a machine learning system, that can now be fed a new voice and tell us what it knows about it. Is it more diabetic or is it hypertensive or anything like that? Once we have a model, then sort of open-ended, we can make more study, extend and replicate to different populations, looking at different confounding factors or comorbidities. At this stage, it's sort of, the road is wide and long. On the technology side, all the studies include recording the voice on the phone, and we are very specific that we don't want to provide the phone. We want people to use their own phones because we're not doing academic research to find some mathematical property of the voice. We're trying to do something that can be implemented in a real world quickly, which means it should work on people's phone. If it only works in a recording lab with the most perfect environment, it's really cool, but it's not useful. So we created an app that is both Android and iPhone based. We can send it to the subjects. It's meant to be very easy to use. It's configurable. It could be for a study where you record the voice for 3 days, for 40 days, 1 time a day, 12 times a day. It has reminders. It shows you what you should record. You can listen to the recording, press submit. Once the voice is submitted to the server, it is then deleted from the app, so no record stays on the phone, which makes IRB much happier. This has been approved by IRB for multiple studies, so it's matured through multiple IRB submissions. On the back end, once the voice gets received by a server, we've automated a lot of the analysis process. We start with quality control. So we have a system that checks that people have said what we expected them to say. We trim the silence, we remove the background noise, we confirm that there's only one person speaking or that it's the same person who was speaking before. We've had instances where some of our patients would ask their kids to record the voice because they didn't have their glasses, they couldn't read it. They're like, can you read that for me? That doesn't work. Things like that. Then we do feature extraction. This is mathematical processing of the voice as a signal to find all those properties like pitch, fundamental, say my voice again, fundamental frequency, and so on. So I need to drink. Downside of working with voice is using it. Feature extraction usually generates a lot of features, dealing with hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands, but we want to have as few features as possible because we don't want a model that is overly parameterized. So we do feature reduction, where we try to find which feature are associated with the voice and which feature move the same way, which means they probably measure the same stuff. We can just use one of them. That's called feature reduction. Then we test and train a model. And we split the data so that some of the data is used for training the model. Some of the data is never seen by the model. It would be used to test it after. And of course, the data has to come from subjects that are balanced. When we're doing a study on, let's say, diabetes, would have the case control. So our case would be diabetic, our control will not be diabetic. We need to make sure they are balanced from age and BMI standpoint, because we're not looking for a biomarker of older age or heavier BMI, we're looking for diabetes. So when we split the data, it's the same. We want to make sure that everything is balanced by whatever parameter usually are associated with the condition. We build a machine learning model and then we validate it. So a lot of this is standard machine learning method, but it's largely automated so that we can do this over and over. So these are the projects we've sort of done or are in the midst of publishing, but there's other studies we're doing right now that are still in progress. One of them is blood pressure. Just like we went from diabetes to glucose, we have models for hypertension. We're now working on measuring blood pressure. This one is quite interesting because we started by looking for heart rate. So we're extracting the heartbeat from the voice, which is loud and clear, not that loud, but it's here. And that heartbeat is essentially a pulse of pressure happening somewhere in our neck. So we're characterizing that pulse of pressure and now looking at the parameters of that function to see how much blood pressure changes it. At the same time, we're looking at heart rate variability. Since we can measure the pulse, we can probably also extract with some level of precision heart rate variability. So a lot is coming out of that study. It's still underway though. We completed recruitment and are doing the analysis right now for pre-diabetes for the South Asian population in Canada specifically. The South Asian population in Canada is very, very prone to type 2 diabetes, much earlier onset, not necessarily the same association with age and BMI because they can start having pre-diabetes at 25 years old. So we did a study of that population in college, and we're looking for biomarkers in voice that can help us screen that population who probably don't even know about diabetes at that age. We often get asked, how do we choose what to work on? Because we have studies all over the place. So we have a bit of a framework, which is based on desirability, feasibility, and viability. And this is where that helps us decide what to work on and what not to work on. From the desirability, we look at an unmet need. There has to be a clear reason why a vocal biomarker would be useful. So for type 2 diabetes, for example, it was obvious. There's a screening gap. It has to be either on a diagnosis side or on the monitoring side or remote access, any sort of need that is bright. On the feasibility side, we need a physiological rationale. We need some sort of hint as to why this condition should affect the voice. It could be very tenuous because it's easy to test through a pilot study, but we kind of hope to have an idea at the beginning. We also look at the study size. We're a small group, so we don't want to do a study that requires 10,000 people or will take 10 years. You know, if we're looking at neurodegenerative disease, for example, perhaps we can detect it in a voice 30 years ahead of time. But I don't think we have time to finish that study before I retire. We need access to subject. For rare disease, there's a big need. Unfortunately, the few subjects who are known are typically enrolled in whatever study already exists. So it's very difficult sometimes to access subject. And this one is the hardest one, is we need access to an objective ground truth. When we train a model, we have to tell it, this is the ground truth, this is the voice associated with that. For some conditions where a blood test or imaging or any sort of objective scoring exists, easy. But for things like pain, for example, if you're studying pain, it's very hard to put an objective level on pain. Subjective, yes. So it becomes much harder to train a machine model because you can't really tell it how objective the truth is. So at best, it's going to be as good as that subjective scoring. So we look for that. From the viability, because ultimately our goal is to deploy this and commercialize it, we need to make sure there's an IP white space. Luckily, vocal biomarker is so new that it's mostly just white space everywhere. But we need to make sure that there's patentability, availability somewhere. We need to make sure it's actionable, that the vocal biomarker, if it is a screening tool or anything like that, it will lead to a next action. Like the patient has to be able to do something with that data. Because the the patient voice, just like the clinician voice, just like the engineer's voice, is very important here. If we tell something to the patient, they need to want to know that and have something to do about it. Sometimes people don't want to do a test. And this is what we call deep co-design. We need to co-design not just with the patient in mind and the clinician in mind and the engineers, but also with the regulatory, the reimbursement, the NGOs that might be the first user of this. Everybody who could potentially be a roadblock or partner in this kind of project needs to be involved, not necessarily all working on it, but at least consulted so that we have an idea of where the need really is. Because we all tend to be siloed in our world and think, I have this great solution for this great problem. And then you talk to a patient, so like, I don't want this. So that's it. Normally I would have a slide saying, my team, thank you very much, but they are right here, so I can just point at that. Yeah. So, thank you. I will move to a chair. I guess I don't need this one. Since any questions, by the way, or how do we do this?
Yeah, so thank you very much. That was an inspirational talk. Very, very nice. We'll have time for questions. I have a few prepared ones to go through to loosen them up a little bit, and then we'll turn it to the audience. So one of the things that stood out in your talk was this general idea of commercialization and bringing products to the masses. Yeah. In science, there's a tension right now that's happening with open science, data discovery, data release, public data sharing. How has your team tried to balance that as you move forward?
That's still tricky. I can hold this one. There we go. From the data side, the data is privately owned, at least for the glucose one, because it was done with a CRO that we hired to collect the data for us. So we only release it with partners under a data sharing agreement, but not to the wide public. When we do study in collaboration with a hospital, it's different. We'd have a collaboration agreement that includes data sharing, and that would vary per hospital. So we try to share that as much as possible. We're doing one with the group in Luxembourg. They have data, we have data. We want to do some sharing. So that's the first part. I think the second part, which is our approach to commercialization, is to focus on wide distribution rather than high monetization. So we're not interested in selling this for a lot of money to a big pharma company, although if they show up with a check, we might say yes. But we're interested in distributing this to the world, specifically Africa, Asia, South America. We want this to be used by as many people as possible because it would help validate the industry. The vocal biomarker industry is so new. We need users first. We want to be like ChatGPT. Everybody uses it, then they need it.
So very nice. So one of the things I saw, and it's something I've gone through in my career and with using convolutional neural networks. One is the saying, when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so once you start seeing an initial success, curiosity says, where else might this work? And so you've gone down this process as well. You've seen early results with voice. Now you're at the point of testing how far those biomarkers can go. How do you respond to this idea that's used particularly for developing individuals early in their career? You know, the hammer and the nail concept is used almost as a negative or a derogatory comment, but yet in science, it seems to be so productive.
I think in this case, the hammer was the final tool we used after using everything. So I'm fairly late in my career, and working with digital biomarker for a long time, we've always had this quest of as little hardware as possible, as low invasive as possible, and as ambient or as easy as possible. So getting to voice was not a random, oh, this worked. It was more the achievement of everything else that I don't want to do. The second part, I think, from the convolutional neural net, we try to use methods and tools that are more grounded in mathematics that we can explain rather than neural nets that we have a really hard time understanding, because we're focusing on IP generation and we need to show, hey, this is what we found. So we do a lot of machine learning that is fairly traditional, as opposed to the very advanced new AI systems that require too much data and are really hard to interpret.
So one question to build on that. So I've done research in diabetes, and one of the things I saw and always was amazed with was how you could train canines to detect hypoglycemia.
Yeah.
In science, that's the ultimate black box. We don't exactly know how the dog is doing that. There's been a belief that it was the smells, so ketones and other things happening. My first thought seeing your talk was maybe it's just the voice and all these ideas about how we think the world works and how you can approximate it. I don't know if you've had those thoughts or
Not about the dogs, but that's a good point. We've had thoughts about what are we measuring? Are we measuring the wrong thing? I had a pretty good discussion with someone about iPhones versus Android. We use the recording of people's phone, and perhaps people with iPhones have less diabetes than people with Android, because they usually have higher income, less diabetes, and all of that. So we made sure our first study was just Android. In India, nobody had an iPhone, so that's good. But it could be other variable. There's so many things we could measure in a voice. It's true. I'm going to think more about the dog one now. Yeah.
So maybe one more. Let me find an easy question. So one of the see what I got hard ones too. So I did see on your sign it piqued my interest on the patent process, and so within Mayo, and I see we have one of our technology agents in the audience. We've had a hard time challenging or communicating a patent around AI, and so part of what we're trying to learn is, do you describe it as a mechanical process, or is it actually just the code itself? And so from your IT perspective, are you thinking of it as a mechanical process that you're trying to get the patent around because the sort of the elements of life may or may not be as patentable?
It is. So I have a very hard time understanding or describing what our patent lawyers do with our papers, but generally it's about the features we extract and the weight we assign to those features to build a model. We try to stay away from the word AI at all. So it's very much, hey, we count all those things, we organize them in this way, we set up a computer with that interface to retrieve them. So it's very mechanical in a sense rather than AI. But the patent process is probably the least comprehensible part of my work. Usually when I talk to the lawyers and they send me back the patent and say, hey, make sure it's okay. I'm like, I guess. It's very hard.
All right, looks like we have a brave soul from the audience.
Excellent talk. Thank you so much. Very inspiring. So I just, you keep talking about the voice, right? So recently, actually, I'm taking a class regarding different voice. So I suspect the voice you have to use for analysis must be the normal speaking voice, right? If a person coming with a pseudo voice, like, when they sing, would that be able to be used as sample for detecting, either high blood pressure or diabetes?
Super good question. So we're still researching this. The very fascinating part about this field of research is it's new. So many questions are yet unanswered. One of the big area of research is the voice itself. How natural should the speech be? So for example, I speak with an accent. Would that work or not? We're doing a study on that right now. Or people who speak a first language as a tonal language have a superior ability to sustain tone. So their shimmer and jitter is probably lower just by the nature of the fact that they speak Mandarin or Cantonese. So we are exploring this. But if you were singing as opposed to speaking, we haven't tested, but I'm almost sure it's not going to work, because by singing, you would have different pitch, like everything would be different. So our general direction right now on that is that we need to study more the impact of the first language. We are also trying to get away from language. First, we try to get away from fixed sentences to random sentence. Now we're going away from sentences to just sounds. We ask people to go, ah, and in that sound, we hear all kind of interesting stuff. The harmonics are very clearly defined. That's where we found the heartbeat, for example.
Excellent. Another question, actually, I'm a pancreatologist. I'm very interested in what you mentioned about the pancreatic cancer detection for the using the voice. So we know actually up to 3 years before the diagnosis, patients start have body composition change, including losing their subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, about, they have the sugar going up, they have a lipid level going down. About 6 months prior to the diagnosis, they have the, how to say, the muscle mass decrease. So in your study, you are trying to carry out, are you interested in doing the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, or are you more interested in predicting potential pancreatic cancer based on a change of the voice? Thank you.
I think we're interested in early screening. We don't want to call it diagnosis because regulatory, but early screening maybe as a probability, but ideally of pancreatic cancer that's already here, that just hasn't manifested visibly yet. That's what we're interested in. But in terms of the pathophysiology and what stage of the, it's not prodromal, but the invisible phase is, we'll need to work with clinical partners because we're engineers to know exactly what we should be looking for and what timeline, should we look 3 months before diagnosis, 3 years, and what we should look for. We look for people like you to help us.
Thank you so much. Actually, the follow-up question, actually, this is from my colleague, my friend, asked me if you're interested in actually have Mayo Clinic as a site for your studies.
Yes.
Thank you.
Please take notes. Yes. Call me.
Thank you so much. I followed your work since that day the paper was published. I work in Rochester. I'm visiting here today just for 1 day. Saw you speak here, so I'm here.
Thank you.
I don't want to sound like the glass is half empty, but I often worry about the ethical aspects of this. I mean, if somebody wanted a blood sample from me, they would have to have my consent and then take the sample. If voice becomes a sample, do you foresee a world in which when you speak to a life insurance company, they can already know that you have diabetes and decline you or give you higher rates based on that? And do you foresee any unintended consequences of these types of markers being built into like interactive voice systems on phones, so the business you're trying to interact with knows more about you than they ought to?
Absolutely. The pessimistic side of me say this is going to happen no matter what. In fact, it's already happening. There's a lot of AI, not really acoustic analysis, but sentiment analysis of the voice that are built into phone system now. When you're talking to a salesperson or tech support, that would do electronic triage on, okay, you should probably speak to the manager now because I can see you're getting angry. Or I can try to sell you life insurance because you sound like the right person for this. So this is happening already. Initially, we were extremely concerned about this. This is why we worked on fixed sentences. The system would only work if you say a sequence of words that you're unlikely to say. The reality is that it's not very convenient for scientifically, and it's going to go to fixed sounds. So the covert or the nefarious use of that will probably happen, just like it happens with facial analysis. And in fact, I'm sure you've experienced, like we all have, that if you're talking about barbecues right now, you're going to get ads for barbecues in 5 minutes on your phone. So it is listening to you already. The next thing it would do is diagnose you as opposed to try to sell you something. So that's the pessimistic or realistic view. Yes.
Thanks so much for coming and presenting, and very exciting if you'd be willing to work with us here at Mayo or if we have different ideas. But one thing that comes to mind, I see a lot of people with reflux, and actually I see a lot of patients with voice changes, and there's thought that reflux is contributing. And I think this is something that's really interesting to think about. But more importantly, we screen patients for esophageal cancer, and actually we don't have our screening test is an upper endoscopy, which is expensive, and only 10% of patients who have esophageal cancer have actually had a screening test. So we're missing most of the patients, but the main risk factor for esophageal cancer is reflux, and that causes something called Barrett's. And I wonder if there'd be changes in the voice that we could see with that.
I've had a few discussions about this today, and that fits, if I go back to my opportunity slides. So there's an unmet need. There's a solid ground truth. I'm sure there's an IP white space here. So that would be a really interesting thing to do. I'm quite interested in that. Especially you could do the voice recording just before you do an endoscopy or an actual diagnosis, and then we'll know right away. That could lead to now earlier diagnosis, but just knowing at the same time, the study would be so easy to set up.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll send you an email. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah, real quick. Excellent presentation. Thank you. So going back to, I like how you called it old-fashioned machine learning. I think it's going to be not too long. A lot of this is old-fashioned, but thinking about that in the CNN is I wonder, do you think at some point in the future you may turn to neural nets, or is that just a matter of data access and amount of data availability, things like that?
Right now, I don't think we've identified a need. I think if we had a ton of data and machine learning wasn't working very well, maybe we would look at those techniques, but I would really rather not, partially because a lot of us have a mathematics background, so we kind of we like to know what we're doing. IP as well is easier with models. And I'm afraid that if regular old school machine learning technique don't find a signal, it's probably not here. If it needs so many layers of dimensionality to emerge, I don't know if it would have an application, but I could be super wrong. This whole field is changing so quickly that maybe in 5 years, AI would do this super easily.
So we may have dinner tonight. I might try to convince you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We obviously work in a hospital. We see a lot of patients. A lot of patients have diseases that we capture. Should we be, as an endoscopist, we are now thinking about recording all our procedures, not knowing we know it's data, it could be important, but we don't have a good use case for it today. Should we be capturing our patient's voice for two reasons? One, to help folks like you and others develop algorithms, which will eventually be deployed. But two, perhaps one day that data may be able to be used to predict the change in voice, for example, could be used to predict X, Y, and Z disease.
I think it'd be amazing. For whatever reason, like having sample of voice collected, there was a patient at a conference I was at 2 days ago who had a laryngotomy. I can't say it. He couldn't speak anymore. If he had recording of his voice, we could probably make an AI clone of his voice that would replace it. So just having voice recorded to begin with is a really good data point. It's almost like, those embryonic stem cells you get from the cord. But in general, for future application, like if you have longitudinal data on patients that includes voice recording, as the field of vocal biomarker matures and the techniques improve, you could now do all kind of fantastic analysis. I would urge you, if you start recording voice, make sure it's saved uncompressed. Most audio recording nowadays are saved in MP3 or AAC, any sort of compressed format, because it works really well for hearing. But voice analysis, like what we do, requires uncompressed, because a lot of the acoustic features in a voice are outside of the hearing range, which is what compressors remove because nobody hears that, but that's what we need. So uncompressed data.
So maybe one last comment. So you've talked a lot. I love this as a framework, and I think a lot of this ties on awareness of the world around. So the unmet need, the evolution of technology, what can be done. What are techniques you and your lab use to stay abreast of all changes that are happening?
Coming to places like that and talking to doctors is fantastic. Reading a lot, going to conferences, knowing that we are missing 90% or 99% of what's published and just living with it. But maybe that's another reason why we're staying on machine learning rather than AI, because machine learning doesn't evolve so quickly. So it's a bit easier to stay abreast of development. AI is just the fire hose or drinking from the hose, whatever it's called. It's impossible. If you keep up with what's new, you can't do any work.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.